If everyone wants to, if you want to introduce yourself in the chat, maybe while we're waiting for people to hop on. All right. I think people will still trickle in, but I don't want to spend too much time waiting for people to hop on. So good morning. Welcome to our inclusive mentoring workshop. My name is Elise Thurber. I'm joining us from Boulder, Colorado, and I do some work for the Navigating and the New Arctic Community Office, and we're hosting this inclusive mentoring workshop today. And with that, I just want to turn it over to Beck Batchelor and Dana Stamo. So take it away.
Sorry, I was trying to see you all while I'm unmuting myself. Thanks all for being here. I'm excited to be talking about inclusive mentoring with you today. I'm Beck Batchelor, and I'll be working with Dana. We talk about inclusive mentoring, especially in the realms of working with REU and undergraduate students, because research shows that students who have good mentoring relationships are generally happier and more efficient and feel success from doing that work. Do want to acknowledge that there's contributions to the slide from Val Sloan at NCAR, the SOARS program at NCAR, and the GeoREU network, which is a network of people who run REU programs all over the country. Dana.
Hi, everyone. I am Dana. I'm a fourth-year PhD student. I study biological engineering, and right now I'm working on developing some new medicines for infectious diseases. And when I'm not doing that, I like to think big thoughts about science and identity and belonging in STEM. And so this has contributed to my being a co-founder for the student organization STEM Roots. And the entire point of STEM Roots is to help first-generation, low-income, and underrepresented students sort of find their path and their identity in their STEM fields. And I'm really excited to be here and talk with you all some more about mentorship. Back to you, Beck.
As I said, I'm Beck Batchelor. I actually came from a polar science background, spent some time in the Antarctic and in the Canadian high Arctic. But these days I focus nearly exclusively on increasing diversity and inclusion in the geosciences, and one of my favorite roles in that work is as a co-lead of the GeoREU network, which is a network of people who run REU programs across the geosciences. We do have a lot of resources around running an REU program available, and I'm going to be sharing some of those with you today. We'd love to ask you to weigh in. Feel free to unmute yourself and speak up, or to pop it in the chat. How do your experiences with mentoring motivate you being here today?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I think learning from like elders, Alaska Native elders in the community is a really great experience. Learning about the culture and different things is really motivates me, and I'm glad to be here today to learn more about mentoring and how I could become a better mentor. Thanks.
I am a professor at the University of Oregon, and I am fairly new to mentoring. I had a really small lab for just like 1 or 2 people for a long time. And now my lab has grown and I have more diverse students in my lab. And so I wanted to attend the event to learn more about how to think about inclusivity as my lab grows and changes.
Thank you for being here. Anybody else like to share?
I'm going to highlight, someone just posted in the chat. I haven't had a lot of formal education in mentoring, and the topic sounds particularly interesting. I've also had some excellent mentors and some without as much mentoring skill. I'd like to be more intentional with my own mentoring. I like also that this individual mentioned that sometimes bad mentorship can motivate you to want to be better at mentorship, right? And not sort of put people in some of the uncomfortable situations that you may have experienced. But I like that a lot of the focus has been on these very positive experiences with mentorship. So I'm really excited that everyone here is looking forward to use mentorship as a productive way to enrich their community spaces.
Absolutely echo that. I think that many of us want to give back once we've had great mentoring relationships. And I think more than ever, we're really aware of how important it is to do mentoring right. I mean, the environment that we're in is changing, and that's a good thing. And we want to make sure that we're not bringing the trauma of our own bad mentoring relationships into our new mentoring experiences.
Yeah, and research shows that a bad mentorship experience can actually do more harm than a good mentorship experience could potentially address. So it's important that we get it right. All right, so as we begin our deep dive on mentorship, I wanted to sort of touch on what mentorship looks like in this very traditional sense. So mentorship was actually born out of this very straightforward training for tangible skills, things like how to operate a machine or an instrument. So someone who had more experience in how to operate that instrument, right, would give a novice guidance on how to perform the task. And this is totally fine for executing a protocol. And this kind of teaching absolutely has a place in academia, right? But this kind of teaching gives kind of lackluster results when we're attempting to teach someone about identity or belonging or professionalism and their style and how they show up in this space. So when you teach identity and professionalism, the way that, you know, the sort of hierarchical traditional mentorship process worked, you risk generating what I call mini-me's, right? And so this kind of mentorship ends up contributing to a very overwhelmingly homogenized academic professional space. And it mostly commits to advancing research and perpetuating the status quo under this guise of, you know, we're doing this for belonging and inclusion, when in fact it's just to sort of keep the same idea and metrics of success that we've seen thus far. So I wanted to show you all this video real quick that satirizes this kind of traditional type of mentorship between a graduate student and their professor.
Hey, Professor, I'm here for our meeting to continue working on that research paper. Great. Where do we leave off? I know we just met last week and had a very detailed conversation about this project, but as your advisor, I forgot about 95% of that discussion. And I'm slowly learning to not internalize that as a form of personal rejection. Looking at the analyses now, I see we ran analysis A, but I think we should run analysis B instead. Okay, but I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes trying to remind you how we had this conversation last week and you decided that analysis A was the better choice. And then I'm going to disregard all of that and say we run analysis B over the weekend anyway. You say we, but you really mean me. You got me there, but don't worry, I will vastly underestimate how long it will take for you to put in this extra work and reassure you that it'll just take a few minutes. And after I put all that extra effort in, you're gonna remember why option A was better. That's probably accurate. It probably is. Well, good luck on that analysis that I'm gonna change my mind on again. I'll see you next week. See you next week. I'm gonna forget this conversation as soon as you.
Okay, so can someone post in the chat or unmute and share sort of what did you notice about that interaction? What are some of the things that stood out to you?
It's a very classic management kind of role. I will assign you the task, you'll keep everything in your brain, and then you'll come back to me and maybe remind me of some pieces and I'll assign you more tasks.
Right, like you'll remind me of things, but I'm going to ignore them anyway. Right, because I didn't say them in this conversation. I need to maintain this air of social dominance, right? I saw that Mary Beth posted having flashback of past mentorships. Right, that's scary, right? Anything else? Let's get one more before we move on.
Oh, I love the time, you know, like how much time it's going to take. Like we all underestimate that one, and I'm guilty of it too. So I appreciate like that reminder that, yeah, these things don't take very long if you don't actually have to do them yourself.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I think Laura mentioned exactly what I wanted to say to that, Melissa, is that there's no sense of collective responsibility for the work, right? There's sort of an unequal division of labor here, which to me signals that there's a very clear power dynamic, right? The professor didn't even consider the labor associated with that data generation. And the professor always got the last word, right? Regardless of what the student said, even if the student was repeating things that the professor had said in other conversations, that also robs the student of the opportunity or even the permission to explore options for what the next steps in the research are on their own, right? So how would the student even figure out what the next steps are in their work if they don't have the opportunity to practice it? Can you give me the next slide, Beck?
Research paper. Great.
We love those animation glitches. All right, so I wanted to take this as an opportunity to introduce inclusive mentoring. We don't just want to tell you what not to do. We want to give you some tips on what you can do to be an inclusive mentor. So I like to draw a lot of inspiration from peer mentorship, meaning a connection in which the mentor and mentee are very, very close in experience and knowledge, right? So this is usually like, you know, a freshman being mentored by a junior or something like that, right? So the experience is a lot closer. And this tends to sort of blur the line of the hierarchy, and it softens the power dynamic because it passes it back and forth between the mentor and mentee. They take turns being student and teacher rather than having someone always be the student and someone always be the teacher. And this puts more emphasis on the relationship, and it fosters a culture of constant learning, right? It values new ideas and creativity because they can come from any participant in this relationship. Instead of telling someone what you would do in the situation, there's a lot more of this collaborative problem solving. And that helps people figure out what their own style is, how they show up in challenging situations, and how they show up professionally as well, right? And because you're seeing all of these different sort of approaches for what someone's professionalism looks like, that gives you confidence in navigating sort of your own experience yourself, right? So I like to think of this as like mentorship is more of like putting training wheels on your own bike and sort of learning how to ride it rather than having to accommodate to someone else's bike, right? And so in making space for all of these different approaches to success, we're then able to support people in bringing more of themselves into their work and sort of compromising less on who they are while they engage with something that they're passionate about. Elise, did we lose Beck?
I think we lost Beck. Yeah.
Oh no. Well, let me go ahead. I have the slides, so I can screen share. I'll take over real quick.
Big data.
Yeah.
Can I comment on Nora's and Twyla's comment in the chat?
Absolutely.
I think something I can turn on my video so you can see who's talking, so I'm not just this so I'm Mary Beth. I was gonna say that sometimes it's helpful just to say like if your memory's not good and just to be honest about like my memory's not that great. So I'm gonna try my hardest, like write down. I work with Nora, so I'm like, I think Nora and I both feel like I don't remember this, but we remember we don't remember the same thing. So it helps. So together we remember everything. But I think just that reminder of like just literally saying that my memory is not always the greatest. And so that's been helpful in the past for me with people who don't have good memories.
Yeah, totally. And I think the important part is not like you have to have a perfect memory. The important part is like if your student says that you had a conversation, give your student that credibility, right? Your student has no reason to lie to you or gaslight you about what you said, right? So having that conversation and seeing them as an equal rather than someone who has to be sort of steamrolled in the conversation, I think is the really crucial point there. But thank you for amplifying that, Mary Beth.
I have something to add to that too, although I don't want to disrupt your flow too much here, but I think that though some of that is just about the dysfunctional culture of academia where like as you become, you know, so further in your career, you have to take on too many things and then you're too busy to pay attention. You know, it's like this sense of busyness and not giving your full attention to things. So I think that's, for me, I know that's at least part of it is that like I'm often distracted. And I think that's something that I appreciate that you, that video kind of forces us to think about that piece. Like, am I really focusing here on this, this person who's in front of me? So
Yeah, definitely. We're gonna dig a little bit deeper into that too in a couple slides. But Beck, we didn't get anywhere. I was pulling up the slides, so we left off right on our being human slide.
Awesome. So the first thing that I always encourage people to think about when they're meeting with undergrads is to remind them that you are human too. I think when we start out, especially if you're working with somebody who is a big name in your field, then it may feel really super intimidating. And I think it's traditionally been that often we leave our identities at the door when we come to work, and that's not the ideal situation for building really inclusive mentors. So don't be afraid to share the fact that you have kids and pets, that you like to dance, or share a little bit about what was challenging along your own journey or what scares and worries you. Being human is really an important way of helping to break down barriers. And I put a little caveat on that until your student trusts you, it's best not to require them to bring their trauma to work, so to speak, but create spaces where you're able to share from your own perspective rather than requiring them to share. In many cases, students who may have been hurt by the system in the past may be a little bit more reserved about what they're willing to share. But the more you can create space and vulnerability, the more that you're able to invite them to share the pieces of their identity that matter to them. Also, share your enthusiasm. I think that so often mentors go right in with a whole bunch of scientific papers, which especially for an undergraduate are incredibly daunting. So think about how you might reach them with the exciting parts of your research in slightly more accessible ways. Have you got photos or videos that you can share with them? Can you tell them why you're so excited in this work and really what the big picture of the work is? Why did you get into it? Why are you excited about it? How is it going to contribute to meaning? And how does it contribute meaning to your own lives when you're doing it? And some examples there are videos, news articles, photos, and sharing some of the challenges of that work too.
So I want to talk about sort of this irony in the academic professional world. This article, The Importance of Stupidity in Scientific Research by Martin A. Schwartz, I think captures this phenomenon very well. But essentially what it says is that if you're conducting research on the thing, you must admit that you are, for lack of a better word, stupid about the thing, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing research on it. We wouldn't be asking questions about it if we knew about it, right? And despite that admission and that sort of fundamental sort of mindset, right, that context that necessitates your work, we still see academic professionals step out of their offices and pretend to know everything or pretend to have a hypothesis about everything, right? There's a struggle to say, I don't know, right? And this kind of what I call performative know-it-allism creates a toxic culture of unrealistic expectations and self-doubt for others. And some of you might recognize these as symptoms of imposter syndrome, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in a second. So part of your work as an inclusive mentor is to show vulnerability. And when I say vulnerability, I want to be very clear. I'm not talking about heavy personal things, right? So you don't need to come into the office and talk about like your messy breakup last weekend. That's not what I mean when I say vulnerability. What I'm talking about is just being human, right? And so in this case, vulnerability really means not knowing loudly. Let people see you not know. Let your students see what your process of figuring out an answer would look like. Let them see what you Google. Let them see what questions you ask. Think out loud for your students so that you can role model what that process is. And remember that you also need to normalize research setbacks. It's not always going to work, and you have to normalize and reframe failure. And the failure piece is really important, right? Because remember that in a lot of cases, the students that get into RUs are artificially selected because they got good grades, which means they have a really, really difficult relationship with failure because it is the antithesis of success in a coursework setting. So you need to work with your student to help reframe what failure looks like in the research context. Can I have the next slide, please?
Yeah, I might just add to that really quickly,
Yeah, go for
Dana. We've really seen in REU settings that a lot of students struggle with exactly that piece, and articulating it out loud is really valuable. So just saying, I know you're a great student, you know how to do school, you've been practicing that for 20 years of your life now, and you know how to get the right answer and to do well in exams. research is fundamentally different. If we knew what the answer was, then it wouldn't be research anymore. So what we're really trying to do when we're doing research is figure out the hard stuff when nobody knows what it is. And so you do have to sort of step into this uncomfortableness with being uncomfortable. And then that can be a real struggle when you know how to do school really well. So I always like to share that with the students, as Dana said, because it really does help them to understand that sort of feeling of cognitive dissonance, I guess, between knowing that you're a really good student and then struggling with this stupidity. I like this this quote: research is what I'm doing when I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah. That's awesome. Thanks, Beck. All right, so I wanted to revisit imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is what happens before we fully realize and embody that a lot of academic professionalism is performance. So if we look at the research about imposter syndrome, and imposter syndrome is sort of the sensation that you feel like you are an imposter who doesn't actually belong in the role that you're in, that you're going to be found out. And this can contribute to a sense of self-doubt, of anxiety, of perfectionism, overworking, and just a sense that you don't really belong in the space, right? And a lot of students and a lot of new faculty, sort of people who are entering the academic space, will feel this in excess. But research shows that women and people of color experience imposter syndrome more than white men. And this makes sense, right? Because consider that our metrics for success were modeled after the dominant demographic in these spaces, so whiteness and masculinity. It's a lot harder to perform these metrics of success if you don't personally identify with them, right? And so this article, Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome, is really interesting analysis, sort of looking at how we've used imposter syndrome to place the blame on the people experiencing it, rather than taking that as an opportunity to look at the toxic norms within the context that made them experience that in the first place. Now, I also want to mention that imposter syndrome is one term for a lot of different experiences that have similar symptoms. So imposter syndrome is not the cause, imposter syndrome is the symptoms, right? And these tweets acknowledge this. So these tweets, Professor Andrew R. Timming, he is a straight white male professor, and he posts that even though he studied at Cambridge, he made full professor by 40, he wrote 2 books, he still feels like a failure. And I thought that this response from a Black woman in an MD PhD program, Neoma Adaku, she says, "This is why I personally don't jive with the imposter syndrome term, because my feelings as a Black woman who academia systematically excludes are lumped in with the insecurities of successful white men." Now, I will put an asterisk here and mention that I don't think this is the most constructive discourse, and I don't think that Twitter conversations are the best place to be unpacking this kind of heavy material. But I think there's a very important point here. I don't think that either experience is more or less valid than the other, but they are different and they shouldn't happen. Neither of them should happen, right? And so the reason I bring this up is because maybe a student comes to you and they say, "Hey, I'm not really feeling like I belong. I feel, I'm feeling imposter syndrome." Well, maybe their imposter syndrome is a completely different cause than your imposter syndrome. So telling them how to resolve it or giving them that same pep talk that helped you may not be the best way to go about it. So this is why it's so important that even if you have similar experiences, that instead of telling your students sort of what to do in that situation, that you help them sort of pave their own path, and then they'll know how to deal with those challenges in the future as well. Anything else to add to that, Beck? All right, take it away.
I think it's also really important that we think about accessibility. And accessibility needs can be an initial conversation. Who are you? Your pronouns, what activities or what needs do you have in terms of delivering materials? Maybe you have some long-term needs like text-to-speech software or physical disability needs, and maybe you have accessibility needs that change day to day. I mean, an example right now, I'm suffering from COVID. You'll see me flicking my mute on and off to cough. And that's hopefully going to go away in the next little while. But being open about the fact that what you need on any given day might be different. And that might look like having your camera off during a meeting. That might look like not having meetings at 3 o'clock because somebody's got to go pick up their children, whatever that might need. So just being open about what your own needs are, as well as what the needs of the people that you're mentoring is, it can be really helpful. And I highly recommend this paper if you haven't thought about centering access needs, just as a kind of extra resource. Also want to encourage you to center kindness. Both science, the process of science, and being an inclusive mentor can be super hard. And I think you need to be really aware of the fact that doing this job right sometimes feels great and sometimes it feels really hard. And we all make mistakes. And I think being humble and having some humility around that is helpful for your mentee, but it also opens a door that allows feedback. And say, I'm working on this. I've never mentored a student from your background, or I'm coming from a place that's very different. For me, I come from New Zealand. The culture is different from the culture here in the US. And sometimes I mess up. So if I do, I would love you to let me know. That said, only allow for feedback if you're genuinely willing to learn from it, because there is a challenge that if somebody raises something and then you come across extremely defensive, that you'll actually break down that relationship.
I think assuming best intent is a good guiding principle. I always like anytime I enter a new space that I'll be working in for a while, whether it's like a summer program or lab meetings or something like that, I like to sort of build collaboratively with everyone there. We like to build sort of our guidelines for how we expect to treat one another. And I've gotten quite good at facilitating this kind of work. So now I'll always sort of like push us towards assuming best intent, right? Like we're not here to sort of call anybody out. We're here to make it a constructive, empowering community space, right? And that means that we're not going to assume that anyone here is being malicious. So there's no reason to respond as if they are being malicious, right? And so I think that sort of guidance can really help us remember to keep kindness at the center of everything. I want to take a moment and give you all a chance to reflect on ways that you can practice inclusive mentoring and bringing in vulnerability into your current relationships that you have now, the spaces that you currently occupy now. And again, these don't need to be elaborate. So one of my favorite ways to bring vulnerability into my professional space is with my water bottle. It's covered in stickers. The stickers are all of my favorite artists and my favorite anime. And I have made so many awesome relationships with students because they recognize the stickers on my water bottle. And then we find out that we have something in common. Another one that I like a lot is letting my music play when I'm working in a room or in the lab. I'll let my music play out loud. This is significant because I'm a small girl who listens to a lot of metal. So you also make a lot of friends that way too. And so even like really simple things like not closing out of your Netflix or your YouTube tab when you screen share. If you're comfortable doing so, going backgroundless on Zoom. And so people can see your apartment or see how you've decorated your office. But I wanted to open it up to you all as well, to post in the chat or to share if you want to unmute. What are some of the ways that you can bring vulnerability into your professional space?
I think probably when you're teaching, not trying to talk too much and try to explain something when you don't really know about it.
Mm-hmm.
That you don't know, and then maybe you'll find out what the answer is, or just being honest with them, letting them know that you don't know, so you'll go ahead and find it out.
Yeah, I really like that. I do that a lot. I'm very, very clear with saying that I don't know, and then sort of screen sharing and showing what I would Google to figure out what the answer is. Or another one I really like is asking the class, like, does anyone here know what that is? I don't know what it is. And that levels the playing field a little bit. So students feel like, oh, we're on the same level here. We're learning together, right? This isn't you aren't some guru, some unattainable skill that I'm trying so hard to achieve, right? We're all working together to learn. I like that a lot. Thanks for that, Bruce. Anything else?
I've done a lot with like trying to create space that feels inclusive. So my lab is actually right next to my office. And we have, an old school record player, and we have like a bubbly water machine, and I bring coffee. We have coffee, and I have snacks for my students. So that's been my way of trying to, and then just creating, giving everyone a good computer so they have, a space to work. So that's been helpful in trying to sort of create this community of people.
I love that. There's almost this level of like romanticizing the office space, romanticizing the office setting that I think goes into that. I really love that.
Yeah, and we
so-
have people kind of drift in and out too, like,
Yeah.
you know, professors who need coffee or whatever. Or
Oh,
who need a
that's
snack.
so cute.
So it's mostly my group, but there are people that drift in and out. So that's been kind of nice and fun.
Yeah, I love that. I'm also seeing some posts in the chat here, feeling grateful for the earlier discussion about preparing for a meeting with a mentee. I'd like to be more intentional about carving out the time to prepare so I arrive at the meeting feeling up to speed. I love that. I have little running files all the time with each of my students' information on them. And I'll take notes on our meeting, not just notes about like the research, but also like notes like, it's my student's birthday this weekend. Like, I hope it goes great, right? And then you check in with them about that. And that's a way that you can sort of foster that vulnerability too. Let's see, Jenna says, I once had a professor who told the class he would always say, I don't know, rather than pretend to be an expert. And it helped us connect with him so much more from the get-go. Completely agree. I love saying I don't know. It makes you feel so much closer with your students. It's great. Chloe says, I like when folks, especially professors, take a moment to introduce themselves personally and share personal photos or interests rather than simply introducing themselves professionally. Yeah, I like that. You get to see sort of like the multidimensionality of people's identities. It's really cool. Oh, Mary Beth, you've done a set of rapid fire questions based off a podcast hosted by a Native woman with mentees. I love that. I think that's awesome. I think that's a really cool way to sort of cut through the professionalism and just sort of like start building like that deeper relationship. These are all amazing responses. My whole point with this is that vulnerability and inclusive mentorship is not like this extra to-do list on top of all of the work you're already doing. It's stuff that you can build in. It's stuff that you can rearrange your environment around the way Melissa described, or it's just about how you show up in class, right? So it's really pretty small things, like seemingly small things that can make a really big impact in helping you connect with your student and with your community. All right, I'm going to pass it back to Beck. She's got a exercise on how to do some active listening.
I'm sure many of you are familiar with the idea of active listening, but surprisingly, it's one of the skills that we don't learn very much in our academic training. I think we tend to be trained quite intensively on how to write and how to speak in professional settings, but listening isn't something that we always learn. So I'm reminding you about active listening a little bit. When you're really actively listening, first and foremost, you pay attention. You put down your phone, you put down the other things that you're trying to do in the background, and you genuinely listen to somebody. Tricky, you withhold judgment. You withhold the questions and the responses that come up immediately in your head so that you can really concentrate on what that person is saying. Then reflect on what they've said and ask clarifying questions. It's really only at that point that you might summarize what they've said and consider sharing back out. So really, I think in our heads, often when we're listening to somebody, we immediately go to how are we going to problem solve? That's part of our training as scientists for many of us. Or how are we going to respond to what that person has said? But the reality is that in active listening situations where you genuinely have somebody listening to you and you withhold those questions, you start to interpret a whole lot more from what's being said. So we're going to do a little practice. We're going to jump into some breakout rooms, and we're just going to be in pairs. We're going to spend about 1 or 2 minutes with somebody who's the speaker, just talking about something meaningful to them. So for instance, what your dream vacation might look like. We don't want to make you go too vulnerable here. But the listener should really practice active listening. So for that first 1 to 2 minutes, you can use body language, but really resist the urge to interrupt or respond. And about 2 minutes in, we'll send you a little ping. And after that point, you can ask some curious questions. Questions like, you want to tell me more about, or what do you mean when you said that? Or how did that make you feel? When you said that, I felt connected to that because. So I'm just going to open the chat here because I can't see everything in the same space. Some great questions in here, but we're going to break out into breakout rooms. Alyssa, are you able to help us out with that? And we'll just spend about 3 to 4 minutes in those breakout rooms.
Yep, opening those now.
Is everybody able to get into their breakout rooms?
It looks like Anne Garland did not, so, oh, Jenna's alone, but that's okay. Jenna works for NNA, so that's not a big deal.
You can go in and join her if you like.
I can join Jenna. Yeah, you're right. I'll join.
Yeah.
I'll leave you guys here.
Okay.
Oh, wait, Anne moved. Okay, everyone's in a breakout room, except for
Awesome.
us.
Cool.
And then you want me to broadcast a message in like 2 minutes?
Yeah, about a minute and a half. You can say you're now able to ask questions.
Curious
Okay.
question time. My cat has been shockingly absent. Normally she's like all over the desk, especially when I'm presenting.
I love people's cats on Zoom. Like,
Yeah, that's why I brought it up. People in the chat are mentioning how much they love seeing the pets on Zoom, the pets and kids on Zoom. I love it. I think it's great.
We should give people the opportunity if they want to go back into their rooms and switch positions. I think we've got time.
I think
Or
so.
would you
too.
prefer not to?
I think we've got time.
all right, it's been a minute and a half. Let me add this message.
I am definitely at half mast, Dana.
What's that?
I'm definitely at half mast. Feel free to like correct me or remind me if I'm saying something dumb.
I'm like so inspired with how you are like rocking this though. I keep forgetting that you're sick.
Good. That's the point.
You're gonna take the fattest nap after this too.
Exactly.
Oh, Beck. Yeah, rest for the rest of the day and the rest of the week, maybe.
I love that quote that if you don't choose a time to take a break, your body will choose it for you.
Isn't that the truth?
So true. It's so true. And it's so clear. Last year I was not taking breaks. I was sick for like 3 months straight almost.
Hey, Bruce. At least you want to give a 60-second
Yep.
warning and close it.
Oh, you're fine, Bruce. Thanks for letting us know.
It's so frustrating, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm closing all the rooms now.
Thanks, Elise. Hey, Chloe. Sorry, Bruce's microphone wasn't working. That must have been frustrating.
Oh, it's okay. Technical difficulties happen. I did my best to active listen to the silence.
You had to listen really closely, huh?
Oh, that's okay.
Welcome back, everybody. How was that?
I thought it was good. I I felt like I was very good at active listening, but then I was doing what I often do when someone tells me, then I wanted to tell her about myself instead of asking questions. And I was like, oh no, like she told me about her vacation, and then I wanted to tell her like something about me instead of asking questions. And I was like, oh no, this is when it, so I had to like quickly transfer, if that makes sense. Like I started to talk about myself, and I was like, oh, I want to do that.
Why do you think that happens? I don't think you're alone in that experience. Why do you think that's our tendency?
I think I was just trying to relate, like say like, oh, I understand, that's similar, but we don't always have to like talk about ourselves. Like I could have focused. Yeah, I wasn't following the directions and thinking about what I should be doing. So it was good.
No, it's exciting. Yeah, no, you're right. Like it's exciting when there's overlap in our experiences, right? It makes us feel close to people and we want to share that, right? I don't think there's anything wrong with it from an intention perspective, but I do think like you're right. Like there's a bit of frustration because people don't feel like their side is being heard as much, right? So one thing I like to do when that comes up is I'll transform the story that pops up into my head, the point I wanted to make with that story. I turn that into one of those curious questions, right? So if my dream vacation, I'm excited because, oh, I really love winter. I want to go somewhere where it's going to be very cold. I want to ask like, how did the seasons and the weather factor into this being your dream location, right?
And Mary Beth put in the chat just before we left that with active listening, it's also important to notice when a bias is coming up. And I think that that self-awareness that comes when you're really actively listening and not immediately responding is great to hear. When you're immediately starting to think of your responses in your head, then you're much more likely to accidentally bring out something that you might not have otherwise done. So I think that's a really important point too. For those of you who were speaking, how did it feel to be actively heard?
It was good.
It's amazing how infrequently in our lives we really have somebody deeply paying attention to us, right?
She said she couldn't talk about her dream vacation for like 3 minutes. That's what she said at first. I was like, what?
Twyla, did you want to add something there? I think I saw your mic come unmuted.
Oh yeah, I appreciate the part where then there's like follow-up questions too. I think to me, that feels like a big part of active listening is the part where you ask for more, because we're all commonly, we start with the like skim at the top. Hi, how are you? I'm fine. I'm fine. But that's what we're just, what you say without whether you're fine or not.
I think that that's very true. And when you're thinking from a sort of coaching perspective, asking follow-up questions is really important, because in most cases, students and those that you're mentoring actually have the solutions in their own head, and they know what's going to be the best response for them. And the more that you can ask questions that help them to come up with their own solutions rather than telling them what to do, the better you're empowering that inclusive mentoring.
I think those sort of curious follow-up questions are also really important to go alongside with the clarification questions, right? I don't know if you've ever had a conversation with someone who like tries to make you feel heard by repeating what you said, and they're parroting it like so explicitly that you're like, it almost feels worse than them not understanding at all, right? So I think pairing that sort of clarification with a question that goes a little bit deeper can be really validating.
This is one of my very favorite quotes. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I really encourage you to think about somebody in your life who has listened to you very actively and made you feel empowered or heard or like you really matter. And I think we all have that experience that we can draw on. So we wanted to give you some really practical tips that might help you out with being a mentor as well. One of the first things that we found really helpful is to provide structure. So a work plan is really valuable when you're working with students. In many cases, they don't see the big picture as clearly as you might when you've been in the field for a really long time. So things to think about is, what's the objective of that research project? What milestones are you going to try and accomplish over what time period? And when might there be some of the inflection points where you have to change the plan? Because when we're doing research, obviously we might think that the next step is going to be X, but actually it turns out that that method didn't work or something else. So there's going to be some known places. It's also really helpful for the students if you can give them a number of different things that they can work on, so that if you're not available at any given time, they're not going to be held up, but have something else that they can turn on to. When you're thinking about that work plan, being flexible is really important, but it's really helpful if you can plan some small early successes. What do I mean by that? If the first week of your experience is going to be reading papers, you're going to turn your students off really quickly. So if you can, in the first week, help them make their first plot, for instance, then that's going to engage them a little bit quicker than if you start off with the background material. So if you can create a space where they do both of those things, that's really helpful. Provide examples. If you're able to give them some code that they can work off, if you want to give them, if they're going to be working on code, or think out loud. If you want to show them how to work things, let them control the mouse. That's really helpful. And be super explicit about your expectations. What do I mean by that? If you want to meet with them, or you want them to be able to come and meet with you whenever they like, what do you need from them for that information? I found one of the best things that my advisor ever said to me was, it's not helpful for me if you walk in the door and say, I don't know what I'm doing. It's much more helpful for me if you come in and say, I've been working on this and I've tried this and this and this, and I need some help to get here. And that helped me to think about what the barriers to my success were. But it's also really helpful advice for your students, and you sort of say what you would like them to come to you with, or when you'd like them to come to you with. So that work plan is one way of doing that.
I think the work plan is also a good opportunity to ask students how they want to be celebrated or how they want to be communicated with, right? And also acknowledging that there is going to be an implicit power dynamic between you two just by virtue of you being a professor and there being a student. And so I like to find some more creative ways to ask students these kinds of questions. So if I were to ask a student, like, you know, how late are you willing to accept emails? I worry that my student is going to feel pressured to say, email me anytime, I'll get back to you anytime, when in reality, they want to be done with their work by 6 p.m., right? So what I ask instead is, describe your ideal work day. And then that will imply to me, oh, I want to be done by 6 p.m. All right, I won't email you after 6 p.m., right? So remember to keep in mind that there are some implicit sort of systemic structures that you're working your way around, and being explicit and cognizant of those is really important. So I really like this idea of sort of creating opportunities, creating space for students to occupy. I like to think of this almost as sort of when something gets removed, it almost acts as like a vacuum. Something's going to come in and fill that. So if you create space for your student, then they can come in and they can expand to fill that space. And so a great way to help students learn how to navigate situations is to put them in those situations with you nearby for guidance. So, but that also means you have to meet students where they are, right? In some cases, maybe you tell a student, hey, there's a conference coming up, you should apply. Maybe in other cases, a student needs an extra push. They need a little bit more sponsorship from you, right? Like, hey, I submitted your name for this upcoming conference. Are you available to do it? Let's start developing an idea for your presentation. Sometimes that extra push can be really helpful. I wanted to also recommend that you work with students sort of collaboratively to figure out what their plans are after they graduate. So that can be talking about what graduate school looks like, what that application process looks like, and what that timeline might look like for them down the road, and the places in which you're going to help and check in with them along the way. And I also wanted to bring up one of my favorite strategies for helping students build confidence in the academic space. For example, if they're watching a presentation, whether it's in lab meeting or some sort of a department seminar, sometimes students have questions that they're afraid to ask. And so you can really serve sort of as a bridge to help them find that confidence. Say, if they're afraid of asking their questions, maybe they write them down and you discuss them together afterwards. Or maybe your student writes down questions and then you use your own privilege based on your positioning within this community space, and you ask the questions for them and give the student evidence that they are asking good questions. And this can help them find that confidence to sort of raise their voice on their own. But look for creative ways where you can plug in and help your student get to the next step. Figure out where those barriers are and how you can serve as a way to circumnavigate those.
Just adding on a little bit too, if you are able to bring your students into your group meetings or to take them along with you when you're going to talks, if you're going to a virtual space, I'm going to be here, I'd like you to come, or we're going for lunch, come on, let's go. I think that the barrier to attending these things when you feel like you're totally new and that you may or may not be welcome is much higher than if somebody literally knocks on your door and invites you along, or somebody that you know is going to be there. So as much as you can, take your students to places, and that can be in the virtual space or in the real space. And if you're at a conference with those students, take them with you to the events that you know that are going on. If you're going to the Earth Science Women's Network lunch at AMS, you can totally take your student along with them. Or if they want to go to an identity-based group in an organization, in a conference, you can volunteer to go with them. You're always welcome at those events, especially when you're taking students along. I always like to highlight this, the sources of stress in an REU. And this graphic I really like because it encourages the students to recognize that when you're learning, you don't learn very much in the comfort zone. But as you move out into the space where you feel more uncomfortable, you're maximizing your learning. And the point of maximum learning is really right at that point where you start to slip into the panic zone. And I like to use this as an example of why we want to stretch ourselves when we're doing internship, but also that we don't want to sit in the panic zone for very long. It's good to be right on that point, but if you're sitting in the panic zone all the time, then that's not a healthy or a safe space to be. So giving them the language that they can say, right now I'm pushed so far out of my comfort zone that I'm starting to panic. Can we dial it back? And for you as a mentor to recognize that. I think it's also really helpful for us to think about the sources of stress in an REU. The science growth curve, as you know, is very steep to start off with. And possibly the most intimidating point is when you know just enough to know what you don't know. And I think a lot of times students really struggle in weeks 2 or 3 when they now realize how much they don't know and start to feel really worried that they're not going to be in there. The students also really want to impress you as a mentor, and that can cause a lot of stress. The concept of professionalism, our students often have never been in a workplace before, so they don't know what the right behavior is, or they don't know whether they have to change the way that they are. And having those conversations and opening those spaces is really helpful. I'm not advocating for people to feel like they can't come exactly as who they are. But I also think as a mentor, it's our responsibility to say, if you go to the AMS meeting, then people are going to be in business suits. You don't have to be that, but I want you to know that that's where you're at. Or if you're going to be at a poster session, you're going to be on your feet for a really long time. You might want to pick shoes that are comfortable. So helping the students to navigate what to expect, even if not expecting them to actually fit in, which I think is really important. And I think our younger generation is much more conscious of than our older generation is really important. People's identity definitely comes into the equation when you're in an REU or an internship environment. If you've come from an Arctic community and have never been in a university environment, there's a huge dissonance between my life outside of my work and my space in the work. And that's stressful. If you're totally having to code switch all the time, trying to come up with a new identity for yourself as a scientist and close off some pieces of your identity, that takes an awful lot of mental work. And so sometimes when you've changed culture or changed places, or you're in that environment, there is so much work going on into trying to figure out how to fit in. that starts to impact your sense of self and cause stress. And another thing to be really aware of is that when you come into an environment, especially if you come in from somewhere else, you come into this new university, or you're doing an in-person internship, you might have lost all your support structures at the same time. And this is also true for students who go off to grad school, for instance. And you no longer have your best friend you can call on at the end of the day. You might not know where you can safely go running. You might have foods that you would normally eat that are no longer available to you. So all of those things that help you to feel grounded as a human being may no longer be there when you move into this new environment. So as mentors, just recognizing some of those things can be really helpful. Coming into Boulder, bringing students from diverse groups into Boulder, which is a high socioeconomic, very white environment, I like to give them a list of where they can buy Hispanic foods, where they can get their hair cut when they have locks or African-American hairstyles, where the local churches are, because that's an important source of support for many of our students. So thinking about all of the different things that may be required for those students to be success outside of just their science support is really helpful. You want to add to that, Dana?
Nope, you got it, Beck.
Awesome. All of that said, we really want to identify that as a mentor, you don't have to be Yoda. You don't have to know everything. You also don't have to be Lucy. You're not expected to provide psychiatric help. It's really important that you take care of yourself and build the right boundaries for you to be successful as well. I always like to say to our REU program leaders, if we don't take care of our mentors, then our whole program's fold, right? So it's really important that you also have the support you need as a mentor. And you can encourage your students to get support from people outside of where you are. You can get support from friends, from therapists, from community. You can encourage students or connect students with others who may be able to help with mentoring. Maybe there's a grad student who's worked with that computer code that you're asking them to work with that you can connect them to. Maybe there's an affinity group in your institution that you can make some introductions so that they're able to help find senses of mentoring and community that you may not personally be able to offer, and provide resources for counseling if necessary.
I think having language ready with which to acknowledge that you don't have space for a certain topic or a certain discussion at the moment is really important. So thinking about that ahead of time can help. One of my favorites is, I'm really, this sounds really heavy. I just don't have space to help you carry this right now. Or if you're looking for additional support, here are some resources, or better yet, foster a culture where you ask the person first if they have space. So whenever I call my best friend or whenever she calls me, the first thing we ask if we're about to vent is, hey, do you have some space right now for something kind of heavy? And, either we say yes or we say no. If we say no, that's okay. I'm going to go call my mom. You're totally fine. If we say yes, then the follow-up response is, do you want to problem solve or do you want to vent? And then that can sort of help figure out what kind of active listening we're looking for in that moment. All right, so I wanted to pivot a little bit and talk about identity and holistic mentorship. So when I say identity here, what I'm really referring to is sort of this myriad of perceptions of self that each individual is crafting for themselves based on their participation in activities, their belonging to certain communities and the different kinds of roles that they take on. And some key components of identity in academia are the sense of community and belonging, this significance and the real world impact of the work you're doing, and then both this internal motivation and this sort of external validation and appreciation for the work that you're doing. And the reason I like these three areas of identity building so much is because they all tie into the sense of power and agency for students. And this unifying theme is, I think, even more important when you look at it from a holistic perspective, meaning that all of the aspects of a student's identity and all of the implications of the work that they're doing and the roles they choose to take, these things are interconnected. They can't be separated from the whole. So this means that your student is bringing a lot of different aspects of their identity in, And they're also trying to negotiate how that fits into the identity that they're seeking, which is their identity with this academic space, this field that they're seeking to integrate with. And so your job is helping students figure out how their identity manifests in the professional space, sort of figuring out what that professional flavor of their identity is. Can I get that next slide back? So I work with students a lot to help them find their identity. And one of the main ways that we practice this is through what I call main character mindset. And I did not invent main character mindset, but if any of you are on TikTok as much as I am, you'll know that it originated from there. And main character mindset, it was just a trend. It was a hashtag on TikTok, but the whole concept was that people decided to live their lives as if they were the main characters of their own story. And I think that this mindset shift, while subtle, is actually really profound. So one thing that it does, the main thing it does, is it takes all of your challenges, all of the obstacles that you're facing, and it reframes them as these really careful plot devices that are important for your character development. So all of a sudden, it's not meant to tear you down, it's meant to help you grow. And that mindset shift sort of encourages you to run full speed towards your challenges because you're excited to see where you'll end up at the end of it, right? And so this can almost protect a little bit. It gives a little bit of cushion to this fear of failure. It's not failure anymore. It's part of the process. Now, I think this is really important because another thing it does is it emphasizes that pathways are no longer necessary. You don't have to know exactly where you're going to step in order to still be committed to the journey, right? It romanticizes the journey over destination. And I'm still rooting for the protagonist of my favorite show, regardless of knowing how it ends, right? I'm still excited to see my character grow and succeed. And this helps students make subconscious decisions because they're doing it for what is in the present moment rather than some nebulous abstraction of a career choice 5 years down the line. So that brings me to another point. I really, really don't like 5-year career plans. I think that they're very limiting and they create almost like artificial metrics for failure and success. Like if I don't get that internship, does that mean I can't be a scientist? And I think we want to protect students a little bit from that kind of binary view of their career path. And you also don't always have enough information to know where you're going to end up in 5 years or to know where you want to end up in 5 years. So instead, what I like to do is think about my ideal community, my model community in 5 years, right? And so I'll invite my students to create playlists or Pinterest boards or YouTube playlists that sort of capture the essence of what inspires them. And this is really helpful if students don't really have a role model in the professional space, right? So students are underrepresented and there's not a lot of scientists that look like them. Sometimes that means they get to draw inspiration from things that are not research related to sort of pinpoint where their identity shows up in that professional space. And a lot of this is trial and error, but you should encourage students to sort of show up the way that they would want to. What would be a way that would inspire them if they saw someone else showing up that way? And so this is sort of a way to sort of collect and practice the kinds of things that inspire you. And then I'll ask them, where can you find that community? Where can you find these people? So let me get that next slide back. I wanted all of you to try this out. I wanted to encourage you all to take a few moments and think about what your 5-year plan is for your community rather than your career. What kind of spaces do you want to be in? What kind of things do you want to talk about with your friends? What projects are you passionate about? And where can you practice that? Where can you share that kind of passion? So feel free to unmute or post in the chat some of your idealizations of your dream community.
I think one of my plans is to increase the Upper Tanana language speakers in the community. There's probably 50 or less speakers, so helping people learn the language is one of my 5-year plans for the community of Upper Tanana.
I love that. And finding that connection in that shared language is so inspiring. What else? All right, Twyla posted in the chat, I like to foster a community in which folks feel responsible and independent in creating their own path, but connected with others for asking for help, sharing ideas and supporting each other. I love that. So community of support where that support is offered sort of willingly, voluntarily, and there's gratitude shown for that rather than something that feels compulsory. I really like that. Let's get one more. Okay, well, let's move on for now, but I encourage you all to keep pondering about this. Think about how you want to show up in your community and where you want to be. Oh, thank you, Anna. Figure out how to create community in remote and hybrid settings. I love that.
As an extra tool that may be helpful for you to think about when you're working with your students is this Earth Science Women's Network mentor map. And the idea of this mentor map is that not one person can be the mentor for everything that you need. Just like your husband or your partner should not be the one person in your life who fills every need that you have. In your career, you also have that same need. So things that you might think about is, who are your role models? You may not even know them personally. Who do you go to when you need to vent? That person might be totally different from the person who you need to advocate for you behind closed doors, or the person who provides sponsorship for you. You need intellectual community and you need emotional support. And we always like to acknowledge that that can be from your family, from your friends, from your religious community, or it could be professional therapists. You can look at who you trust to offer you feedback at the 10% thought out idea level, or who you might turn to at the 50% thought out idea level, or who might give you feedback once an idea has really been cooked out. And thinking about who in your own professional life fills all of these roles is a super helpful activity for all of us to do. But for students, you might encourage them to think about who they have in these boxes and help connect them with people for the boxes that they don't yet have people in. And this link has some handouts that you can use with your students to do that.
I just had a thought back as I was looking at that. I think another way that you can show vulnerability is by acknowledging who's in your box, right?
Yep.
So you just mentioned that sometimes the emotional support can involve a therapist or a family member or a best friend. And I remembered that I'm very, very open with my undergraduate research assistants about like, oh, I can't meet at that time, I have therapy. And my students have actually opened up a lot about their own mental health. And they tell me when they have therapy, they tell me that they had a breakthrough, that they're in a really great mood this week. And I think having sort of that level of vulnerability where you're not talking heavy things, but you're saying, hey, I know heavy things happen and you're allowed to have heavy things. That gives students the space to work through that on their own without feeling the pressure of, having to still show up 100% when they're coming into work. So as we close here, I wanted to take some time and think about what supports do we need as mentors in order to show up, right? So think about things like boundaries, right? What are some ways that I can't show up for students? In some cases, I won't share my phone number with students until the program is over because I don't want that overlap between my work and my personal life, right? So what are some of the boundaries that you need? What are kind of the either boundaries or supports, right? In what ways do you need people to help you stand up, and in what ways do you need space? Feel free to unmute or post in the chat.
One of the supports that I need is a co-mentor. I don't like to be the only mentor of a student because I need to have some space to take time for vacations in the summer with my kids who are only off during the summer. So for me, it's really important that I have a co-mentor who we can take time off and ensure that our mental health needs are met and our family needs are met.
Oh, I'd like to add to that, Beck, that I really like co-mentorship because It just allows a mentee to see that there are multiple perspectives on like a way forward or a way through something. And I often feel a little intimidated by the kind of pressure or responsibility that I know my perspective is somewhat limited. And so I really need other perspectives to be part of the conversation so that I can work through, you know, a supportive problem solving situation.
Thanks for sharing that, Laura. I totally agree with you. And also,
Sajid.
one of the things that I like in my co-mentoring, maybe not necessarily in a formal role, but if I can connect a student with somebody who might be in a different discipline or from somebody from a similar identity from them, when I don't feel like I'm in the best place to share with that, if I can make those connections, always checking in with that person that they also have capacity to do that. I certainly don't like to throw anybody under the bus there.
Saw Jenna also posted in the chat a boundary, not connecting with students on social media. I think that's a good one.
I love to invite students to my house for a meal. They can see my family, they can meet my pets. But one of the boundaries that I set on that is that I don't provide alcohol. I feel like that's an interesting and potentially dangerous space that I don't want to go into.
I actually have a consistent boundary. I actually don't let people over to my house unless they are one of 4 people. My house is not a place to host things. And a lot of that too is actually spiritually motivated. This is my sacred space, and I work really hard to keep it like that. And I don't let people in here unless they're on my short list of people I can really, really, really count on.
Thank you all for
I
sharing.
think one thing on my course syllabuses, I have hours and then by appointment for students to contact me or have a meeting, kind of give them an idea when I'm available.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. And I think it's really important that as mentors, we protect our time for all of the different things that we have going on. You're a mentor in one piece of your identity, but you're also trying to do your research or teaching or be an active member of your community. So that's a very, very valuable boundary to set. Anna,
Yeah,
put in the, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say I taught a 200-person freshman class last year. So boundaries are really important, but then like that experience reminds me to tell my students, they're the TAs, right? The grad students are the TAs that they need to set their boundaries, and then it's evolving and changing. Like at first they were giving out their cell phone to students and I was like, are you sure you want to do that? And they were like, yes. And then anyway, your boundaries can change as you evolve and learn and have new experiences. And I think that's important too.
Yeah, I love that you acknowledge that the dynamic nature of boundaries, right? That they're not always going to be in place, and that, if they change, it's not up for negotiation, right?
I like what Anna just said here, that there's an expectation that her students will communicate and be responsive. And I think that's a particularly helpful one to remember as you're working with the new generation of students who maybe don't look at their emails every day. If that's the way that you communicate in the workplace, I expect you to check your email throughout the workday, and that if I email you, you're going to get back to me within 24 hours. Or we're going to use Teams if you need a quick answer, but if it's going to be something that takes more than 5 minutes, then just ping me and we'll set up a time to talk. Whatever that expectation looks like around communications is super helpful.
Yeah, I'm seeing Chloe is also resonating with this time boundary approach, not even just because like I can't respond at that time, but like I can't show up 100% if we're doing it when everything else is also in motion.
Thank you all for sharing those things. I do have some extra resources for you. I think Elise has been putting in the chat the link to this drive. In that folder, you'll find both example communication and work plans, some suggestions on how you might give feedback in a kind and meaningful way, some examples of curious questions that you might want to ask your students, or how you might frame questions when you're moving past this active listening to coaching, some effective communication worksheets, suggestions around boundaries and mentoring, and also a list of some national crisis hotlines just in case you need them. I hope you never do. It's very helpful to know what the resources in your own institution or your own community are, so that you can point those students at help if they need it. So those resources are all there. All of these slides are also in there that you're welcome to use. And you're also welcome to, oh yeah, I always like to end with reminding everybody that mentoring really is a two-way relationship, especially inclusive mentoring. You're going to have a friend out of it. The chances for us to learn and grow as individuals are so high. And when we survey our mentors, almost across the board, people say they learn as much from their mentees as they felt like they were able to give them. That gives them engagement, new resources, new directions, great science, exposure to cultures that they might have had and otherwise not had a chance to connect with, and that satisfaction of knowing that you're giving back. So remember that mentoring is a two-way relationship, and first and foremost, it should be fun. Feel free to unmute yourself, ask questions if you have anything else you want to talk about or share.
We're going to be hanging around here for another like 15 or so minutes, 10-15 minutes. If you all want to comment or ask questions, we'll be here. Otherwise, feel free to reclaim your time. I hope you have a lovely Wednesday, a lovely rest of your week. And I appreciate all of the engagement and interaction that you all showed up with today.
Thank you, Beck, and thank you, Dana. We'll hang around for a little bit for questions. If you are associated with NNA and you have undergraduate students or REU students, I just want to plug we're going to be having some sort of undergraduate research showcase later in the fall. So look out for that email in your inboxes, many months from now, but that is one way for your students to share their research. So thank you.
Maybe I'll give an extra plug too for our Polar Science Early Career Community Office, which is a new initiative out of our office to connect early career polar scientists. And that's something that you're all very welcome to join.